I was going to say good morning, but good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Winterbottom. I'm kind of subbing in for Paul, who would normally be chairing these seminars. And this is one of a series of seminars from Tapas. And if it's the first one you come to, then you can still see recordings of previous ones on our website. And if you're a regular, then you kind of know the format. So today we've got Eben Cross joining us, who you'll see on screen. He is co-founder of QuantAQ, which is based in Boston in the US. And he's helping to develop low-cost air quality sensor technology and DIY Corsi-Rosenthal boxes. He's an atmospheric chemist, which in his words, he designs, builds, characterizes, and deploys scientific instruments that measure air pollution. And he's on a mission to prove that lower cost air quality sensors can measure air pollutants with an accuracy that is on a par with research grade instrumentation, which sounds amazing. And again, in his words, we're in the midst of an environmental sensing revolution, a revolution that's going to enhance air intuition worldwide and empower local communities to bring air quality data to the fight against air inequality. Now, that sounds inspirational, evangelical, and fascinating. And so I think it's time for me to shut up and hand over to Eben. So Eben, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation and allowing me to share some of our thoughts, including my screen. Let's see. Yeah. So really, starting at the top of this, I think it would be helpful if folks feel comfortable just using their audio to interrupt me if things that I'm saying are confusing in situ. I think if this is more of a back and forth, then you'll probably get more out of it as an audience, and I'll certainly get more out of it as a presenter. So feel free to interrupt. It's also possible that I'll get to your question in the next slide, in which I'll just say that and we'll move on. So I'm going to close down the window that I can see everyone's names just so that I can focus. So just use those audio cues. So my focus today is really just to help the Tapas community understand what you can learn by making aerosol measurements in classroom settings, and how you can tie those measurements directly back to, an empirical validation of how quickly does the air in this room get clean? Do the particles in this room get removed? And that's obviously a very important question to answer, both in terms of pathogens as well as air pollutants. And there we go. So the take home really is, and you've probably heard this many, many times, that you can't manage what you don't measure. And frankly, nobody makes these measurements at scale. Nobody makes these measurements routinely in schools. Certainly, very few people make these measurements continuously over the course of a school year. And when I say these measurements, I really just mean, counting up and sizing the particles that are in a classroom environment. This little graph here, and can you guys see the cursor?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Actually, I think I can turn the cursor into a laser pointer. Neat. Okay, so this is just telling you, okay, how much stuff is there in the air, and then how long does it last? How long does it take to settle out of the air? And if you're a sneeze droplet, you're talking about, residence times in the air on the order of seconds. That also means that they're going to be very proximal to the source. And so the droplets essentially are a gravitational removal mechanism that we can rely on. And since gravity exists in all schools on planet Earth, that's actually quite helpful, right? So gravity is a great intervention. We can leverage it to protect ourselves against sneeze droplets. The respiratory aerosols, which fall into this size regime that's quite a bit smaller than those sneeze and snot droplets, they don't have that same gravitational settling. And so they're subject to just mixing around the room. And so that leaves us with this open question: how long does it take to remove them? And you can answer that question having done nothing in terms of the ventilation or filtration, or adding some mitigation to make that go faster. And so my bottom line here is that once you start making measurements in real world environments, real world indoor environments, there's an inherent messy authenticity to what that measurement is telling you. And this sort of begins to separate us from, a lot of the work that we do from a ventilation perspective is theoretical. It's a back of the envelope calculation. It says the room is this big, the ventilation system is delivering this much air, it's removing this much air. You do some, arithmetic and you get an answer. And it says, okay, well, the air change rate is X. I've found that by actually going into that same room and measuring how long it takes the particles to leave, you often learn that the reality is different than the theoretical calculation. And so the question is, what can we do about it? So we built a technology called modular PM, and it's just a PM sensor. And I don't want to get bogged down in the details, but this thing is capable of telling me how many particles there are in the air, suspended in the air in that room. And it's also capable of telling me how many there are. So how many and what size. So we can begin to differentiate those sneeze droplets from the breath-derived aerosol from the background pollution particles that are entering a space. And that's actually quite helpful because each one of those presents a sort of a different removal target for us. And so we want to take this same tech and we want to take it and put it into a classroom. So, and it's actually, I don't know if you guys can see my video, but this is one of the units. It's relatively small and unobtrusive. It's about 10% of the size of the printer in this picture here. And that unit's been running in my daughter's first grade classroom since September of 2021. So arguably, this is one of the longest running continuous aerosol measurements in a real world classroom to date. But if we think theoretically about that room and we simplify it a bit, we can begin to sort of think about the confines in which we want to define the problem. And really, this comes back into people inside of a room, they generate a ton of CO2, and they also release respiratory-derived aerosol. And if we were to measure the CO2, which is often, basically taking the world by storm thanks to Aeronet's technology, we will see the rise and fall of that CO2. What's interesting, though, is people get hung up on the absolute concentration levels, right? They want a traffic light, a green, a yellow, and a red, and you want to transition that traffic light from, like, say, an 800 level where you go to yellow to a 1200 level where you might go to a red. And that's based on relating the total amount of CO2 to the rebreathed fraction of CO2 in that room. Like, how much of other people's breath are you breathing in? What I think is far more useful in the data from CO2 is the actual time it takes the CO2 to go away once the people leave. Because that time scale really tells you everything you need to know about the removal timescales for that particular emission. Now, CO2 is a gas phase molecule, so its removal is going to be a little bit different than, say, the removal of a particle, especially if there's a filter in the room. But anyway, the main point I want to make is short duration meetings can leave long tail distributions of sort of residual stuff that those people breathed out for hours after the fact in underventilated spaces. That traffic light that I'm talking about, we can actually quantify that quote unquote rebreathed fraction. And you can think of this in your head. Every time the CO2 goes up by another 400 ppm, where 400 is the background, you're basically adding a % to the rebreathed fraction. So by the time you're at 2000 ppm, 1 out of every 25 of your breaths came from someone else. And so that's a compelling way to think about it. And David Elfstrom has done a ton of work on this, and I encourage you just to dig into his links and his resources. So as we move along here, we can start to think about, okay, what's the ventilation strategy in our simplified room? And for a lot of the schools in America, this is it. Like, this is as good as it gets. 2 windows being open, and that's the end of the story. So in that context, 2 is definitely better than 1. If we can actually encourage the air to come in and or encourage the air to leave by putting fans in those windows, even better, right? But this is the simplest situation, what we call natural ventilation. And this is the vast majority of schools in America they only have this at their disposal. They do not have mechanical ventilation. Now, when you add a mechanical ventilation system to this room, you get a little bit more of a closed system, and you should know actually what's going on. And this helps us to sort of relate some metrics within the ventilation system to what the air change rate should be, right? And hopefully that ventilation system embeds things like MERV 13 filters, which are decently good at filtering particles in a way that is dramatically improved over MERV 12 or MERV 11. And I know in the UK, you guys have different filter designations that Reese and Stefan can school everybody on. I don't actually know how these things link up, but I encourage you to reach out to them to know precisely. So we need that filtration layer, and we're pumping air into this room. We can end up coming up with, say, a theoretical air change rate based on the size of the room and the rate with which we're pumping air, positive pressure flow into the room. So this room, we're going to hypothetically say the air change rate is 6. And all that is the total amount of air that's being pumped into the room divided by the volume of air that's held within that room. But if we think about it, air doesn't move like toothpaste through a tube. Air mixes all the time. And so one of the confusing things about ventilation and removal rates is this mixing. And because it's constantly mixing, it doesn't decay like in a linear fashion. It decays in an exponential fashion. And in a graph, what that means is over time, the fraction of the air that's exchanged goes down something like this green curve. Or you can think of the input of fresh air into that same room is going up like this blue curve. So in this case, our 6 ACH, and by the way, 6 ACH is the target for all school classrooms. The reality is in America, it's closer to 1 or 2 ACH. But even in a case of 6 ACH, it takes 30 minutes to clear the room of 95% of the air. So we're looking at a half an hour to get to a 95% clearance because of this mixing if the room had an ACH of 6. So 30 minutes is essentially the best case scenario we could offer our kids globally. So the question is, how do you get to 6? And so this gets into this concept of actually using the aerosol measurements to understand the room a little bit better. And one way we can really leverage those aerosol measurements is we can add a humidifier to this room, a little droplet humidifier, and you can create an aerosol distribution that includes particles that overlap in size with the things that we're trying to understand the removal timescales for. And so we can then use the data. So I'm just plotting the actual number of particles in each cubic centimeter of air when that humidifier source is on. So these are the droplets being generated by the humidifier. And I'm using the system to count up only the particles in one size bin. So the particles that are between 350 and 460 nanometers. So these are pretty small particles. They tend to overlap with that respiratory aerosol distribution, at least the smallest size, smaller size tail of that distribution. But the key thing here is that we can use that data to then calculate how long does it take those particles to go away in this specific room under these specific conditions. And you'll note I changed the ACH here to 9.3 because I did this exact experiment in an actual room with an actual back of the envelope calculation based on the theory of the ventilation system. But because I have that empirical measurement, I can then actually move forward if my slide was capable of moving forward. Oh, technology. Oh, there it is. And we can actually ask ourselves, did we get to that business as usual 9.3 for an ACH? And when I actually measure the ACH, if the door is open, this room gives me an ACH of 6.6. If the door is closed, the ACH is 4.5. So we're literally, we're missing the mark here by 30 and 50% respectively. And it's telling me that leaving this door open to this particular classroom is incredibly important, right? So we have to think about this in terms of like, what are the practicalities of, the disconnect between what the ventilation system says is happening versus what's actually happening inside these rooms. And so this is just highlighting the reality is, if we make the measurement, we can really firmly understand and trust that removal timescale, and potentially do things that are accessible, like opening and closing a door, that can in fact have a fairly dramatic impact on the ventilation rate. So the other thing I did in this experiment is I added a HEPA. This is like a wall hanging HEPA. This isn't a CR box. And the HEPA is supposed to theoretically add another 6.5 ACH to this room based on its operating conditions. And that means that I should be able to hit this target now within this specific room of 15.8. And you can see that we get pretty close. The HEPA actually does operate to spec if, again, we leave that door open. If we leave the door closed, we really aren't even getting close to that theoretical ACH with the addition of the HEPA. So all I'm saying is, we have these things that are at our disposal, and thinking about how the air enters and leaves a space ends up playing a key role, and making measurements actually allows us to understand what's going on in reality. So with all that as sort of context, you want to move towards how do we maximize the in-room filtration of particles, whether they're from pollution or from people, and empower people and communities who are generally under-resourced to minimize their kids' inhalation risk and dose. And I think the bottom line here is that what has happened with this Corsi-Rosenthal box, what I call the Corsi-Rosenthal box, revolution, is this is like a perfect example of accessible science. And frankly, I think accessible science is I legitimately think this, best drawn with fat crayons and modeled with Lego, because we don't need to make this complicated. We don't need to make it scary. We don't need to make it intimidating. We can make it accessible. We can make it affordable, and we can deliver ridiculously high clean air delivery rates with these devices. And so with my kids, I went through and I built one of these things. And you guys have versions that Stefan and Reese have been pushing through the UK system. So technically there are CR Thomas boxes in circulation in the UK that do the same thing, that leverage these same principles. But again, something where we can go to a hardware store, buy $100 worth of kit, bring it home, and within an hour build it with your 4-year-old. That's pretty awesome. What makes it even more astounding is that if you take that system, and again, you take it into a lab space. So this is me taking the thing that me and my kids bought and bringing it to my lab. And in my lab, I have a chamber that's like a simulation room. And in that chamber, I can create and sustain really fairly high concentrations of the target aerosols we're trying to filter. And again, we're just plotting the total number of one of those size bins, and we're watching with what happens in the chamber when I have a constant aerosol source, and then what happens when I turn on the CR box to these different speeds. So one of the questions we have ultimately with the intervention is it going to make so much noise that nobody ever uses it? And frankly, if you run a CR box on medium or high, the answer is yes. It's too loud. People will never use it. If you run it on low, it'll actually just be fine. And so we should just focus on the benefits that we get when we run these systems on low. But I guess in this experiment, what I wanted to emphasize to you guys is I'm getting 2 pieces of information every time I turn the CR box on.
Eben, you've got a question. Sarah's interrupting you.
Sure.
So, can I interrupt? Thank you. So when you say not too loud, can you give me an idea of what not too loud is? Is this like hair dryer loud, or like do you know, yeah, what do you mean by not too loud?
So I mean, it gets back to the question of, and Stefan's done a ton of research on decibel levels and how to get them to be quieter. It's in the vicinity of 49 to 50 dBs, which is a background noise that's unnoticeable in the context of a first grade classroom, frankly. I walked into my daughter's open house just 2 days ago, and I could hear the $700 HEPA, which was on high, and it was loud enough for me to hear across the room in a room full of adults and kids. But the Corsi-Rosenthal box, which was on the other corner of the room, was completely inaudible, but it was still running on low. So I guess the thing is, it's not noticeable. In this configuration, within these classrooms, within this size regime and this amount of activity in the room, it is unnoticeable that the thing is on, as compared to some of these other commercial grade HEPAs, which tend to be fairly loud when you ramp up the speed to try to maximize the delivery of clean air.
Thank you.
Sure. So I actually think this graph can be a little bit confusing, and this probably isn't helping, but I wanted to help you guys understand that there's two pieces of information I can get from that experiment. I can understand what fraction of the particles were trapped by the filter or removed as a function of the size of those particles. And I can also do that as a function of the speed of the system. And you can see that as we change from low to high speeds, we don't get a massive increase in the filtration efficiency of a given size, but we do see increases in efficiency as we go to larger and larger sizes. And this is just telling us what we already know about the MERV 13 filters that we built around that box fan. Somebody raised their hand.
Yeah, thanks. It was more of a question on the noise again. I wondered the fact that we're using an axial fan on this is the action to move air through a filter, but because these fans are designed to move air through vents which have very little resistance, I wonder if the noise might be reduced by using a different kind of fan. And the fan I mentioned in the last talk was the centrifugal fan, which is kind of like a mill that you get that is powered by a river. So the fans are kind of, the fan blades are perpendicular to the flow. This is potentially much quieter than an axial fan because it's not chopping through the air. In fact, it's pushing the air, and it might be more efficient.
I think generally, whatever fan is an operable, quiet fan that moves a ton of air is the winner. So I don't care what kind of fan gets integrated, as long as the device is used, that's a win. So in America, it's possible to build infinite sort of degrees of permutations on CR boxes. But if my fan is, if we can get to clean air delivery rates that look like this, and nobody can notice that the fan is actually on, we've won. And I don't care what kind of fan it is. I need people to be able to build it, deploy it, and turn it on and use it. And if those three factors are met, and we're able to reach these levels of clean air delivery at that lowest unnoticeable noise level, then that's a win. And I think in different markets, in the UK market, you guys are subject to different supply chains with different available, hardware. And it really comes back to that trifecta of, can people build it? Is the price point like accessible? And are they going to actually use it? And if you can meet those, then it's a win. So this plot is really sort of trying to, ultimately, the only metric that matters from these devices is the clean air delivery rate. And the clean air delivery rate defines that combination of how much air is moving through the device and how efficient is the filters at filtering out the particles. And so the thing that's different about this plot compared to other CADR plots that you'll see is that I'm literally explicitly measuring the clean air delivery rate relative to the filtration efficiency for these specific size particles. And we can do that because we have the device, right? We have a device, it counts particles, it sizes particles, and I can explicitly quantify the removal of all these different size particles as we change the size of the particle and change the speed of the device. Whether that device is a $70 DIY filter, which is all the data in red, or a couple different $700 commercial HEPAs. So this gets back into the second tier where, I said earlier, can you actually trust the back of the envelope calculation for the ventilation in your classroom environment? Generally, I think the answer to that is no. The next question is, can you trust the CADRs that are reported by the manufacturers of really expensive HEPA devices? And if they're not showing you explicit data and they're just writing a number in a report, as these two devices do, you can see that they're not being honest about what their CDR is. And You know, this is where it gets really tricky because there's huge price differentials between these pieces of technology, and there's, you know, factors of 2 to 3 difference in performance. And those two things are moving in opposite directions, right? So it's insane that the cheapest, quietest, most accessible tool here is literally outperforming the competition by a factor of 3, but that is the reality. So there's a ton of information in this plot. I think you guys should probably just ignore the medium and high speeds for all these. I mean, actually, these guys do a good job keeping the device quiet, even at high speed. So, you know, you do have to take all of these things into consideration. But even in that case, let's say we run this device at high for the duration, then we're basically at a head-to-head with the CR box on low. In that same classroom environment, each of these would be delivering the same level of clean air. The insane thing is, if this is the device deployed in the school and it's only run on medium, we would need 4 of these devices in that classroom, or the equivalent of, you know, well over $2,000 worth of filtration to meet the spec of just one CR box running on low. So now we're looking at a $2,500 to $2,500 price point compared to a $70 price point to deliver the same amount of clean air. And that is ludicrous, right? So we have to be able to help people access and deploy and use and benefit from these types of tools. You know, from my perspective, I've only done a little bit in this space. I really haven't. I've just basically tried to use Twitter as a tool to speak truth to physics, speak truth to aerosol physics, and come back to some sort of common sense metrics that schools can deploy. This device, which I named Gus, and I deployed in the heart of the Omicron wave into this one classroom. You know, it looks like this after just 4 weeks of running 24 hours a day, seven days a week, and only running on low. And clearly it's capturing a ton of particulate matter. I'm sorry, someone trying to okay, I'll just keep going. So essentially, it's delivering clean air. It's helping, you know, lower the inhalation dose of the kids in this classroom in a fairly substantial way relative to the interventions that are deployed previous to that. And, you know, ultimately, I think a lot of the barriers to adoption come back to, is it safe? Is this thing going to spontaneously combust? Like, where is the certification around the device? And there's a lot that's out there that you can use as you know, EPA has published this evaluation. There are certifications that say it is safe, and there are large agencies, including the California Department of Public Health, that are suggesting that this is an effective tool. You know, there's manufacturers that actually understand and can leverage this as both a business opportunity as well as, you know, an opportunity to do good. And 3M is not unwise to that. And then, you know, I think what's so remarkable is how the community in general has scaled the approach, and people have been able to fundraise and we're able to deploy hundreds of units into districts, and those districts and the kids in them are breathing cleaner air, and they're catching less COVID. And ultimately, you know, I think this all comes back to that you know, fundamental take home, which is, how can we take a classroom which with business as usual might keep the aerosols in it for 2 or 3 hours that are breathed out by everybody in the classroom, and convert that 2 to 3 hour time scale down to a 30-minute time scale. And if we do that, we're having a dramatic impact on lowering their inhalation dose. And the really amazing thing is, it's also crushing the air pollution concentrations in these same classrooms, especially in places where you have to keep the windows closed because of the proximal, you know, nature of air pollutant sources relative to the school space, right? So adding these measurements, helping us understand the ventilation and filtration realities, and building narratives that are less politically divisive and more centered on physics. And I know it's foolish to think that people care about physics. And frankly, it's foolish to think that people care about facts. But this also speaks to the need for our community generally to work on that narrative, because narrative is very, very powerful in actually getting people to change. And so the last thing that I can speak to here, and I want to be sensitive to having lots of time for questions, but when I first went into that elementary school, I racked my brain as to how can I communicate in a simple and understandable language to help people improve their ventilation. And I saw the opportunity, at least in school environments where they only have windows and they're not located in locations that get pummeled with local air pollution, opening those windows, having a fan actually pushing air from the classroom through an open door, that can have a dramatic impact on the air change rate of that room without any other filtration interventions. And I tried to convey that here with this fish poop analogy and trying to get people to think of their classrooms as underwater, and either the water is stagnant or moving, and whether or not it's moving is really up to the things that you can do, the things that you have at your disposal for control. And I don't know, this is just my hack at trying to convey that. And this is my, my 6-year-old's hack at trying to convey that. So I really do appreciate the interest and the opportunity to share some of this work. There's a lot more that could be learned from what we're seeing in the data. And I'm happy to elaborate on some of those lessons if there's time in the Q&A.
Eben, thank you very much for really clear and engaging and thought-provoking talk. We've got a number of questions that have come into the chat, and I've just gone back up to the top because I thought maybe I'll take them in order, which may disrupt the argument from the end of the talk slightly, but it's probably fair. Sarah, would you still like to ask a question about traffic lights that might tap into the way in which into the last slides anyway, given kind of clear messaging?
Yeah, thank you. So it was just a question about why do you think that people like that kind of traffic light? You said that the traffic light is much more appealing for people than the amount of time it takes CO2 to leave. Is it just because it's simpler to understand, or do you think there are other reasons why people like that more?
I think generally the average human doesn't like to fit an exponential decay curve, because that's actually really intimidating and not accessible. So I was actually thinking of the analogy of an escalator, and helping people understand that air doesn't move like humans down an escalator at a constant rate. Air is leaving always the same. Instead of that, and the escalator actually is a linear decay, right? Whereas the exponential decay is this weird shape. Frankly, it's because they take the CO2 monitors wherever they go. They never leave them in place. And so they don't actually capture the decay. They just are like inside the classroom and the CO2 is really high. And then they go out in the playground and the CO2 is at background. And there's no information in between the two, right? It's a binary change in their environment. So if we could just encourage a couple of the parents to let the CO2 monitors just stay in the cubby, you'd learn a lot more about the classroom. I think people can see, and this happens on airplanes all the time, and like everybody's tweeting about, who can break the record for the worst CO2. They can grasp onto that multiple thousands of ppm and it being sort of an unambiguous signal that air is literally just not moving from this space. So it's really a stagnant air indicator. If that same space had 6 Corsi-Rosenthal boxes running in it, it could still have really high CO2 and really low particle concentrations. And then your risk would actually be measurably much lower than what you think. So there's a little bit of an opportunity to be misled by CO2 magnitude alone, but there are so few places that are really taking the filtration stuff seriously that's probably rare at this point. Right? So again, it's if you live in a world where ventilation is generally not that well understood and mitigations are relatively low adoption, then the CO2 traffic light is a good indicator that you walked into a stagnant airspace, and you ought to mask up and leave if you can.
Lovely, thank you, Eben. Christina's got a question in the chat. You're welcome to unmute, Christina, or I can ask it on your behalf. And
Thank you. So yeah, it was about the, I think it was answered afterwards that my question was whether there are other than noise drawbacks, like the resuspension of dust that has been settled. So I guess this depends on the position that where you actually put the fan in the class. But then I would ask, where do you measure? Do you measure somewhere that you think it's somewhere, it's a representative point of concentration that reaches the children's ventilation inhalation system? Thank you.
Yeah, mixing is a really tricky beast. I think a lot of the fluid dynamics people have serious hangups when they see somebody like me just rolling into a classroom, deploying a sensor on one side of the room, deploying a filtration device on the other side of the room, and saying that I'm actually characterizing what's happening. To hedge that, I did deploy 5 units, 4 in each corner and 1 in the center of the room during one of the vacation periods for this classroom. I spiked the classroom with NaCl, aerosol, and I watched what the mixing and decay rates looked like at all 5 positions simultaneously. And I proved to myself empirically that the room is well mixed. In other words, that far corner and this far corner actually tell the same exact story in terms of the aerosol decay. And I think that the CR box actually enhances that mixing by pushing the air straight up in this one classroom. Generally speaking, since my device also measures resuspended dust and PM10, I can quantify exactly how much the PM10 signals have been lowered as a function of having added the CR box filtration device. And it's on the order of 50 to 80%. So I'm not generating more dust by adding this device. I'm dramatically lowering the amount of dust. But dust is really, really interesting because the PM10 signal is the human indicator signal, because the kids are generating a ton of dust off of their clothing, their fabric, their shoes, the floor. And this gets into this other disaster, which is all of the consumer grade PM sensors that exist actually are completely blind to dust. They use a nephelometer, it's a $10 OEM, and it literally can't measure anything above 1 micron. So there's all this dynamic variability in signal that's rising and falling with the student's occupancy of that room. And none of that's being captured by the consumer grade sensors. And people could be misled about, the nature of PM10 in classrooms if they trust PM10 as reported by a $100 device.
Thank you, Eben. I don't know your name, I'm afraid, but Dement PE is the Zoom username. You've got a couple of questions. So probably easiest if you unmute and ask them directly.
Yeah, hello. I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry about the delay. Yeah, very interesting to hear about the possibility of cleaning air. I'm a bit concerned about relatively low efficiencies of filters and relatively high levels of recirculation of air. And I'm just wondering if it might be better to also consider higher efficiency filtration and less circulation of air, which might be better if you're talking about infectious particles, for example.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I was motivated to make this plot. So this is literally telling you that even though I only have MERV 13 filters on my Corsi-Rosenthal box, which have a known filtration efficiency for a 300 nanometer particle of about 50%, I can still, at a 350 to 460 nanometer size, I can outcompete a 99.9% efficient HEPA filter because I'm moving so much more air per unit time through those MERV 13s than the HEPA is moving. So this is a 99%, 99.9999, however they want to market it. This is a device that literally will remove all of the particles, but it's literally passing 100 CFM as opposed to, a 300 CFM. And so we're overcoming the differential in filtration efficiency by massively exceeding the flow.
I can understand the overall benefit, but the redistribution of those particles may lead to further infection. Surely, if they're sort of swirling all around the room, you've got clouds of aerosol particles that are being maybe swept up into the air again, rather than having the chance to settle out in a much sort of quieter, more controlled airflow pattern. And the other point I wanted to make was, have you considered using your panels in an existing HVAC ventilation systems that schools may or may not have? Wouldn't that be the first port of call in order to get the best return on investment by improving what you've already got in terms of mechanical ventilation systems? I agree your units are great in a situation where you don't have ventilation, but that might be an even more economical option to consider.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If the mechanical ventilation system exists in the first place, if we take Boston, for example, 30% of the buildings in the Boston Public School District have mechanical ventilation. 70% have nothing. So that's a situation where your only intervention is in room. I do agree that the MERV 13 filters that I put on this box are built for HVAC systems. That's why they exist at the hardware store, and they only cost me, you know, $15. So if the HVAC system is quote unquote able to deal with that pressure drop, and a lot of them say that they aren't, a lot of them install them and they install them in a leaky fashion. And, you know, I think there's just, it ends up being, you know, a quagmire of the bureaucracy of how schools and facilities are trying to manage their ventilation systems and subcontract that stuff out, when literally in the span of 2 hours, a parent can go to a hardware store, build this device, bring it to the classroom, plug it in and turn it on. And the whole thing, the whole smash is happening for less than $100. So, and the device can work for, you know, 6 to 8 months straight. And then the facility people will come at you and say, well, we can't afford the electricity. And honestly, I would encourage the facility people to do the actual cost benefit analysis and incorporate into that analysis the cost of absenteeism. And, you know, it would take literally 2 substitute teachers for me to break even on 6 months of continuous operation of this device. So again, it comes back to the narrative. And I think people really latch on to a cost benefit analysis that they believe to be true, but they actually do the math. There's really not a strong economic reason not to do this. And it's just a matter of whether or not they're willing to do the real math. But I agree, mechanical ventilation systems run properly, maintained properly, adopting MERV 13s and being on a regular schedule that's holding those systems to account is a great layer within this system. Actually adding this in room has serious amounts of benefit to the humans that occupy this specific room. And I think what we're seeing here is that explicitly within the CADRs in situ, we are not increasing the exposure risk. We are decreasing the exposure risk.
Have you seen the White House initiative, which covers an overall strategy that covers your methods of using standalone air cleaners, but also talks about main systems and then the use of air monitoring, as you've talked about, to show that there's effective solution?
Yeah, I think the accountability piece is largely missing, based on you know, people are used to having to spend $20,000 to $30,000 to get a device that can do what our device can do for $1,000. And you know, to some extent, we need to help people understand that this is possible and accessible and usable. But they often they go right from the $30,000 price point for the tech with an expensive consultant to consumer grade sensors that can't make the measurement adequately enough. You know, they sweep right past this middle ground, which is robust monitoring, continuous monitoring infrastructure for the indoor environment. Yeah, that's a complicated market, to say the least.
And the controlled feedback as well from your air monitoring gives you.
Yep, that would be amazing, right? If we can get the HVAC system to be intelligent enough to know when situations are rising and falling, and how to optimize the energy efficiency of that system in accord with those measurements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eben. Pete, do you want to unmute and ask? You've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering about the NOx emissions that come from traffic, because if you open the doors and windows, I wonder if that might flood the classrooms with NOx, in the sense that NOx can't be filtered out from the box.
Yep.
Would schools know if they're in a situation where they should or should not open their windows because it might be next to a road, and might the best strategy for them to be still having ventilation but putting a green wall up, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, if we can get to a space where everybody sits at this B grade and adds in-room filtration devices and keeps these windows closed, that is the best case scenario for a lot of conditions. This is true in extreme temperature situations, right? We're very cold, very, very hot. It's true in wildfire conditions, and it's true in traffic adjacent high NOx CO combustion tracer emissions. And it would be far more effective to, add a second in-room filter and keep those windows closed than it would be to build a green wall. It would also be a lot less expensive. So again, it comes to like a mitigation layer at the policy level, where you're trying to eliminate idle zones in close proximity to schools. I know that happens a lot more in the UK than it does in the US. I just biked to school with my first grader, and I'm biking past the no idle signs and a fleet of idling cars, because so parents just don't care. They don't take the time to care here. So anyway, I think this B grade is really where we want to target the situation, and there's lots of reasons why that ends up being an effective strategy, because you're right.
Yeah.
We can't filter the NOx. So
I wonder how schools might know what they should do.
I mean, they got to use to some extent, you got to use their intuition and their air intuition and their noses to know that there's a significant idling combustion source nearby, and everyone's better off at certain times of day, certainly leaving those windows closed when those emissions are highest.
Also on slide 23, I think it was. Yeah, slide 23, you've got the kind of before and after box. After a month, it looks pretty dirty. Is this because it's trying to sort of effectively clean the outdoor air? Or is it because the room in the classroom was that dirty over a month? And also, was the box still efficient when it looked like that? How would schools know when to make a new box?
Yeah, so this is an excellent. There's a number of excellent questions. The outdoor air in this environment is generally very clean. This is a school that's basically in the woods, and there's very little wood burning happening during the winter. So most of what you're seeing there is the resuspension of dust and sources of dust from the students in the classroom getting trapped on that filter. That's primarily the discoloration, as well as everything else that's happening in that space. The efficiency of the system is, this is something that we need to test, right? That system's now been running continuously for almost 6 months, and I'm going to grab it at the end of the school year, and I'm going to rerun all the CADR experiments, and then unambiguously we'll know whether or not the CADR and the filtration efficiencies have dropped as a function of the actual sort of material on the filters. Generally speaking, I think we aren't going to see a difference there for as much as, say, a 6 to 8 month run in this kind of environment that doesn't have a lot of really high air pollution. But I need to do the experiment and prove it. People throw out 6 months, they throw out 12 months. Frankly, I think it comes back to that question of like, what are people going to do in terms of actually using and adopting the technology, the intervention, and what's feasible, what's practical. I think it's practical to expect schools to replace those filters once a year. And if we can build systems that's and empirical evidence that supports that, then great. And yeah, it's going to look pretty ugly. There are other, and design and engineering challenges to try to solve that, but it's doing its job as it gets dirtier and dirtier. It's just an example of it actually doing its job.
Yeah, I think it'd be really helpful to see that study after, how efficient it is at different stages. But then again, it's like how will schools know when to change it? Would you have like a color chart or something that you've tested, like how filthy they are versus how effective they are? How will schools know when to change them?
I mean, they're changing their mechanical HVAC filters on an annual base, so they should just do the same thing with this. Like, I don't think we need to make this super complicated where someone's trying to like do a pH meter on the sidewall of the filter. Like, what we're doing is we're creating a situation where there was nothing before and now there's something. And as long as that something keeps adding a positive benefit to the classroom air, which I am 100% confident this device is still adding a positive benefit to the classroom air, then the replacement schedule should be built around logistics of what's actually going to get done by the people who run and manage the school. And I think it's probably an annual.
Yeah, thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Eben. I'm just going to look to see Chris. You've just popped a question in. Would you like to unmute and ask directly? It's probably the easiest.
Okay. Well, I'll just read what I've said. It was just, we were talking there about that exposed dirt and dust on the filters. Is there not a concern that could harbour bacterial growth, and it's exposed there for pupils to touch? It's completely exposed, whereas in a HVAC system, it's going to be tucked away in a duct somewhere and out of the reach of occupants using the space. Is that a concern? And then you've just talked about replacing filters. In a HVAC system, you'd replace a filter just via just pulling one filter out and pushing another filter in, whereas these filters appear to be, we'd call it gaffer tape, I don't know what you call it in America, but all kind of taped together. And it doesn't look like it's an easy job to change those filters. In essence, you're just rebuilding a new cube, are you not?
Yep. People have developed the beginnings of, airtight frames for these types of boxes, and they tend to open source those designs. Again, this is literally a decision I made on a Saturday. I executed the build on a Sunday, and I deployed it on a Monday. And I didn't think about how am I going to optimize the replacement of these filters 12 months from now, so much as I was thinking, how am I going to convince the principal to allow me to put this thing in the classroom? So I totally agree with you. The system needs to be built in a way that's, actually manufacturable. It's a DIY device. So like, it's certainly not built to be not rehacked. Essentially, it's going to have to be cut and then retaped, and it's a mess. As far as kids licking this stuff, they shouldn't lick this. They shouldn't lick any of the surfaces in this first grade classroom. They generally don't. And once the teacher told the kids they can't touch it, they didn't touch it. Placement in the room is important. Also, age of the kids is important. I think a kindergarten class is probably going to be the most challenging, and then beyond that, it gets easier.
I've got a question which Sarah's just put a note in the chat, which kind of overlaps. She says she sees real potential for it in design and technology classes. I wondered if, and Hilda says was now CR boxes with frames and filters that can be slotted in. Do you think there's more ownership within the school of a box that they've made, or do you think that a pre-made box that they just buy in and then filters around is?
Yeah, I mean, this is there's a reason why it's a $70 price point, and there's a reason why the other one is a $700 price point. There's a lot that goes into that $700 object that did not have to go into this object. And so I think the ownership piece is key. I think if student groups are building and distributing these systems and upkeeping these systems year over year, you have clean air crews that are middle school student led, high school student led, and then deployed into elementary schools. Like, this is a huge win in terms of engagement, ownership, just feeling empowered. So to some extent, I like the tape. I like the messiness. I like the accessibility. If it means that kids own it and are proud of it and talk about it and spread that, evangelize it, like there's nothing better than that.
I'm kind of, the reason I asked is because I think I might be aligned with your view. Ben, you put a few things in the chat. Do you want to talk about them out loud? It might be the last point that we'll make then, because it's nearly 2 o'clock.
Okay, sorry, I'm not putting my camera on. I've been listening to this while out for my lunchtime run. It's been very interesting. Couple of things, 3 things in fact. First, anything over 35 dBA wouldn't be acceptable in English schools, it'd be illegal. So that's not going to work. The second thing is, how do you ensure one of these things? The third thing is, analyses of far-field dose, because actually it's not exposure that we're interested in, it's dose of viable virions in school classrooms suggest that it's actually very small. So yes, you can have an 80% reduction, but an 80% reduction of a small number is still a small number. And if the children are in close proximity to one another, which they are, because I observe my own children and those of others when I go to the school gate every morning, the concentration of viable virions in exhaled breath is at least 3 orders of magnitude higher than it will be in the air. And so a Corsi cube isn't where you start reducing infection risk. It's one of a number of things way down the line. That's my observations.
Yeah, there's just a lot of questions and comments there. But
I thank you for the talk. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what the other than, germicidal UV installed up top, that's pretty helpful. And kids wearing masks, that's obviously very, very helpful if the masks actually fit.
Well, inoculate them, get the susceptibility down, make sure they all get their jabs. But that's a great thing to do. Yep.
Yeah, I guess dilution is super helpful. And in stagnant air spaces, if I can add one of these devices, I've massively improved the mixing and dilution. And I think the near field exposures, they certainly will not go up if the device is on.
No.
So you think the near field exposures will be higher in the context of Corsi-Rosenthal boxes?
So if the kids, the first thing my kids do to their friends every morning when they see each other is hug each other. And if one of them is in the early stages of infection, when the viral load is at its highest point, now the kid's going to get a whopping great dose, which it isn't going to get.
What if they hug each other? What if they hug each other on the playground, or what if they hug each other in the classroom?
Then there's nothing you can do about it. They're going to get it.
Yeah, I like to think of outdoors is like your kids having a pee in the ocean. And indoors is your kids having a pee in a little tiny kiddie pool.
Oh, only at distance. And the kids aren't operating at distance. They're operating at close proximity. They sit next to each other. Look at these tables in your photo. They're circular. They're sitting opposite one another.
Yeah, I don't disagree that being close to an infected person is a bad idea. I do think that these concentration levels in the near field in the context of a high dilution environment are much lower than in a low dilution environment.
Not really, not if your face is within a meter or so. It's just not going to be. It's not going to dissipate significantly enough to reduce the concentration of viable virions contained in aerosols down anywhere near that you would expect in well mixed air.
Partly because of time, and partly because it might. Well, mainly because of time, actually, because this discussion might continue for a very long time. Leila, you did put your hand up, and I wondered whether or not you had a way to bring the discussion to a close.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the time. I guess what strikes me in the whole of this discussion is the simplicity of the CRT boxes are really compelling for schools because of cost, and others, but there's this tension all the time about where's the scientific data to back it up, etc., etc. So I'm very much with Eben around creating the narrative, and I'm in the something is better than nothing school, as it were. But I think we've just got to recognise, those of us who are championing doing something to save the lives of our children, that there is this tension whilst it's very attractive for something of £150 or so, we always come up against the where's the science and, you know, this micrometer or that micrometer, and we've just got to, you know, push through all of that until the scientific evidence is there. But quite frankly, there's most of us, I think, who are not prepared to wait, and that's why we're pushing into Warrington schools. Very early days, but with a lot of encouragement and enthusiasm for schools to do exactly what Eben is talking about, getting children building their own and taking ownership of that. And we do that on the basis, well, it's better than what they've currently got.
Yeah, ultimately you need lots of layers, and this could be one of those layers. And it's both for protection of you know, pathogens as well as pollution, neither one of which is doing our kids any good. Thank you, Leila. And in terms of Eben's narrative building, Leila, you're absolutely right. I think these feel like a part of building a public narrative across students and across parents and across teachers. But the discussion's been fascinating, and the game of tennis back and forth has been both illuminating and really good to listen to. Eben, thank you very much. You asked for a conversation, and you definitely got one, and so we enjoyed it, and we're very grateful to you for joining us straight off the school run. Just to let everybody know, he raced in, ducked under his canoe, switched the computer on, and then there he was, and so yeah, it's been a great session. Kat's put a note in the chat about future seminars, so please don't forget to join us again, and it won't be me next time, it will probably be Paul again, back to normal. So thanks everybody, and have a nice rest of your day. Thanks, Mark.